Assalamu alaikum. My name is Lazma, I'll be your moderator. Welcome to the session with the topic of Ibn al-Qayyim today, Lessons for Leaders, with Sister Zaynab Ansari. So the description is, patience and gratitude were described by Ibn al-Qayyim as the two halves of Iman. These two qualities are essential for every believer, and this lecture discusses their relevance to Muslim leaders today. A little bit about Sister Zaynab. All right, very brief. She's very humble. She served in the Muslim community of Knoxville since 2014 as a scholar in residence, public speaker, facilitator of interfaith dialogue, youth mentor, and a full-time instructor at Taysir Cemetery. And we don't need to go seminary. We don't need to go that far. But another announcement for Q&A, we're going to have an open mic, inshallah, so no need to use the app. It's a small and beautiful group, so we'll enjoy hearing your voices. Jazakallah khair. Without further ado.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Pray that everybody is doing well. Thank you, Sister Lesma, for introducing me. And don't worry about this. It's happened a couple of times where people kind of pronounce one like the other, seminary and cemetery, and honestly, it kind of, from a spiritual standpoint, it sort of makes sense. From the perspective that when we enroll in a seminary, we really want to learn lessons not just for the dunya, but also to prepare ourselves for the akhirah. So there actually is a bit of a connection there. So I chose Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya because he is, or was, a scholar, and really I think speaking about him in the present is helpful because he is a scholar, if we examine his legacy today, that really exemplifies what it means to be a public scholar and also what it means to sort of live in the shadow, if you will, of someone who was as prominent as his teacher, Ibn Taymiyyah. So what I'm going to actually lead with, inshallah, is I want to give you all a brief introduction to Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, then go into his book, Patience and Gratitude, and look at some lessons I think are kind of helpful for those of us in positions of leadership. Now, the reason why I'm giving you all the background is because the biography of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya helps us to understand why he wrote the book. So Ibn Taymiyyah, as you all might be aware, encounters the Mongols, and he spends quite a bit of time soul-searching. Sort of a lot of the ulama, honestly, were doing that at this time. It's really relevant to what's happening today. But his Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, spends a lot of time embarking on soul searching in terms of why the Muslim world has come under the authority of the Mongols. So the context for all of this in terms of which historical period, we're talking about the 13th century, 14th century CE, and we're talking about the 7th and 8th centuries AH. So in 1258, the Abbasid dynasty came to a catastrophic end when the Mongols sacked Baghdad, and some of the speakers have mentioned that. The death toll was at 800,000. They destroyed the famous library of Baghdad. Over 1 million volumes were lost to history. The reverberations of that, of the fall of Baghdad, really circulated throughout the Muslim world, really impacted the Muslim world, and I think those reverberations are really with us to this very day. So Ibn Taymiyyah's experience of this historical trauma prompted him to do a lot of soul searching, and he actually wrote some fatwa against the Mongols even after they had converted. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim's experiences were also shaped by what he, through sort of the reality of his life, of his story. So let me kind of give you a little bit of that background. He is perhaps best known for being the disciple of Ibn Taymiyyah, and it's sort of, in terms of how people remember him, they sort of characterize him as either a very loyal, dedicated student of Ibn Taymiyyah or someone that introduced his own kind of original thought. I think probably the best way to assess Ibn al-Qayyim's contribution is that he takes Ibn Taymiyyah's theology, and Ibn Taymiyyah, by the way, got into a lot of theological debates with the ulama of his time. So he took Ibn Taymiyyah's theology and jurisprudence and made them accessible to the masses. One of the things that Ibn al-Qayyim did, he actually wrote sort of a didactic, kind of a manzuma, It's called the Nuniyya. So he writes this kind of theological poem that really kind of grabs the attention of the Shafi'i authorities. It makes him popular amongst some of the masses, but not necessarily amongst the authorities, especially the Shafi'i jurists themselves. So his life story really kind of epitomizes certain tensions within the Muslim Ummah. So again, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya is taking aspects of Taymiyyah theology and jurisprudence and making them accessible to the masses. And he also presents a methodology for spirituality without the esotericism, i.e. without some of the mysticism that characterized the Sufi orders of the day. Ibn al-Qayyim, like his teacher, was a prolific author. So he wrote about everything from good health in books like At-Tibb al-Nabawi or Prophetic Medicine, to good parenting. One of the things that we perhaps might not know is that there are pre-modern manuals on Islamic parenting. And this book was called Tuhfat al-Mawdud fi Ahkam al-Mawlud. It's still around. And again, this was a book on how to be a good parent. He wrote books on sports and chivalry. So he had a book called Al-Furusiyya on basically good horsemanship, and books on governance, writing under the Mamluk dynasty, and this was called Al-Turuq al-Hukmiyya. So these are just some of the books that he wrote. Now, why did I choose a 14th century Syrian Hanbali scholar? Because he was Hanbali in his jurisprudence largely. So why did I choose a 14th century Hanbali jurist, Syrian jurist, for a talk on leadership? You know, after researching his biography, and this is a quote that I want to present from a series of research articles on his life, a composite picture of Ibn al-Qayyim emerges as a broadly trained scholar in legal theory, a highly Hanbali-focused faqih or jurist in practical jurisprudence, and a rigorously Taymiyyan thinker in the principles of religion. One may add that Ibn al-Qayyim's proficiency in the doctrine of madhab as-salaf as-salih, the pious ancestors, is also often mentioned in biographical accounts as a distinguished feature of his education. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim was born in, as you can infer from this, in Damascus. He also died in that city. So here's the chronology. He was born in the year 691 AH, 1292 CE, and died in the same city around 60 years of age in the year 751 AH, 1350 CE. His title, and by the way, don't confuse him with another scholar, and that scholar is called Ibn al-Jawzi. These are two different people. Ibn al-Jawzi lived before him, and he belonged to the Abbasid dynasty. Like Ibn al-Qayyim, his madhab was Hanbali, but he lived sometime before Ibn al-Qayyim in Baghdad. So, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, what's interesting is that this title is actually taken from a place his father worked. So Damascus had famous madaris, theological seminaries and schools during that time. So his father worked as a superintendent at a school called the Jawziyya School in what is today kind of the old city of Damascus. His full name was Shamsuddin Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr Az-Zur'i al-Dimashqi al-Hanbali. And again, he is viewed as sort of taking sometimes, and I say sometimes, a less controversial comparative approach to the existing four Sunni madahib, arguing sort of against a rigid adherence to taqleed or imitation, and maybe proffering more of a comparative approach to the existing Sunni madahib. Now, I say less controversial, sort of, and let's put that in quotation marks, because when he's in his mid-30s, he ends up being very controversial, and this is what happens. He travels to Palestine, to Nablus, which is in today's West Bank, and he gives a speech where he basically critiques the practice of visiting graves. And he actually declares that while he's there, even in Al-Khalil, he's not going to visit the grave of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. So, and he says that he's taking the stance basically in deference to the Prophet himself sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and also to his teacher Ibn Taymiyyah. So what happens is that the people in Nablus actually are very upset about the stance that Ibn al-Qayyim has taken, and the governor of Nablus has to intervene to actually get him out safely back to Damascus. So when he gets back to Damascus, what's happening is that Ibn Taymiyyah himself is becoming embroiled in certain theological and sort of fiqhi controversies, and Ibn Taymiyyah is jailed. This happened several times, by the way. But Ibn Taymiyyah is jailed at the end of his life. He dies in prison in Damascus, and now this is where we get to patience and gratitude. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah is actually publicly humiliated for or ridiculed for his association with Ibn Taymiyyah. And for those that are concerned about sort of inter-madhab debates today, or people polemicists on the internet or cancel culture, I want you all to know that some of this behavior kind of goes back quite a few centuries, because one of the things we read about Ibn al-Qayyim is that he's paraded through on a donkey through the streets of Damascus and beaten because of some of the ideas that he's circulating. And he goes to prison. He's the only one of Ibn Taymiyyah's disciples who is imprisoned with his teacher. Ibn Taymiyyah dies in prison, but Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah obviously comes out. And what happens is that even though he has run afoul of Shafi'i fuqaha, like the famous Taqiyuddin as-Subki, he still ends up writing, promoting his teacher's ideas. One of the most important theological works that he writes towards the end of his life is called Al-Kafiyah, where he expounds Ibn Taymiyyah's theology. So I'm giving you all that introduction so that when you look at a book like Patience and Gratitude, you understand that Ibn al-Qayyim is not writing about these things as sort of, this is some abstract theory that he finds interesting, but he actually has to grapple with what does it mean to be patient and grateful in the midst of being put in jail along with his sheikh. So he writes this book called Patience and Gratitude, which functions, it really has, for us, it really kind of has a dual function. One, it's a text of religious piety, so it's fully in line with what other ulama are writing. It's a text of Islamic piety. But again, it doesn't just function as a book for the individual reader, but you can kind of read it communally, and certainly you can read it if you're looking for advice for someone in a position of some responsibility. Now, there is an English translation out there, which again is simply called Patience and Gratitude. You can find the PDF on the internet. But keep in mind that this is not the full work. It really is an abridgment of the original work, and you can look that up too. So if you read Arabic, it's called عُدَّةَ الصَّابِرِينَ وَذَخِيرَةَ الشَّاكِرِينَ. Again, عُدَّةَ الصَّابِرِينَ وَذَخِيرَةَ الشَّاكِرِينَ. And what this translates to is sort of the tool, right? The tool of the patient people, and the sort of the support or the storehouses of the grateful. That's really probably a more accurate translation than just simply patience and gratitude. So keep in mind the translation is an abridged version of this work. So how does he start off? He says that he's really writing this book for a wide audience in mind. He says this is a book to benefit kings and princes, the wealthy and the indigent, i.e. the poor, Sufis and religious scholars, a book to inspire the sedentary to set out, accompany the wayfarer on the path, and inform the one journeying towards the goal. So you can get a sense from the introduction, the way that he prefaces his remarks, that he is really kind of writing within the genre of Islamic spirituality. As I noted, he's famous for Madarij, for the book Madarij al-Salikin, which is kind of a manual of practical Sufism, again, like I said, without some of the esotericism of some of the turuq at that time. First and foremost, as any good scholar is going to do, he's going to establish, his credentials by citing a number of ayahs in the Quran as well as prophetic ahadith on the virtues of patience. So I'll just bring one ayah to get us started off with. Then inshallah, I want to kind of look at some ahadith and unpack some of the lessons from his text. Of course, there are any number of ayahs that we can cite, but this particular ayah, inshallah, you can reference this yourselves in Al-Baqarah. So this is 2:177. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذوي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة وآتى الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البأس أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون. So here's our translation. Righteousness is not that you turn your faces toward the east or the west, but true righteousness is in the one who believes in God and the last day, the angels, the book, and the prophets, and they give wealth in spite of love for it to relatives, orphans, the needy, the traveler, and those who ask for help and for freeing slaves. True righteousness is the one who establishes prayer and gives zakah, those who fulfill their promise when they promise, and of course highlighting this part, those who are patient in poverty and hardship and during battle, those are the ones who have been true, and it is those who are the righteous. So we automatically see that in this ayah in the Quran, a very comprehensive verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making a connection between the foundations, the tenets of faith, social action, social justice, being in a position of some responsibility, and also manifesting patience during times of difficulty. Now, one of the things that Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya does in this book, and he's really quite focused on this, is what is patience? Is patience a spiritual practice? Is patience an emotional state? Does patience sort of have psychological manifestations? It's really interesting that he really tries to settle on a definition of patience here. So this is what he says about patience, that patience is a type of restraint. And he says it's restraining ourselves from despairing and worrying, and preventing the tongue from complaining and the hands from striking the face and rending our clothing. So what he's doing with this particular definition of patience is he's trying to appeal to a larger audience. And he's really kind of arguing against, and again, this is again where we kind of reading between the lines, you can see where there is a form of leadership that he's manifesting here, because he's kind of critiquing some of what he sees in the culture. So he's saying that if we are patient, we have to stop complaining. If we are patient, we should not be striking ourselves, tearing the clothing and what have you. Again, kind of speaking to cultural practices that people would have when they would mourn and lament, they would engage in those practices. So he identifies patience as a moral virtue. And I think this is very, very important for leaders. This is what he says. Patience is a moral virtue that prevents one from doing that which is unbecoming or does not behoove one. So think about that in terms of leadership. It's a moral virtue that prevents one from doing that which is unbecoming or does not behoove one. Patience is the ability to swallow something bitter without grimacing. And he quotes from Al-Junayd when he mentions this. Again, he brings a lot of different commentary on patience from previous ulama and sages. He says patience, for example, is avoiding disobedience, calmly swallowing life's bitterness, and showing contentment and sufficiency in the midst of being overwhelmed with poverty. Again, kind of applying this to leadership, it's the idea of if you are someone that maybe you are directing a project, maybe whatever you were working on did not lead to the outcome that you wanted to see. In Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya's definition, patience is the ability to kind of look at that in a very kind of sanguine way and say, okay, I understand this didn't work out the way that I wanted to, but did I actually lead properly? Did I give the proper nasiha? Did I give my team the tools they needed to kind of produce this, and so on? Now, with patience, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya looks at patience in terms of, is it passive, is it active? So he really kind of understands the different psychological aspects of patience. And for him, it really is a combination. There is a passive state and there is an active state. And the reason why I'm going to say this is because he brings a lot of synonyms for how he understands patience. And I'm going to give you 11 of them, and we can kind of think of these things in terms of their application to positions of leadership. He says synonyms for patience are things like chastity. He actually says that. Modesty, self-control, discretion, abstemiousness, i.e. having a sense of zuhud, forbearance. It's incredibly important if you are in a position of leadership. Measuredness, courage, forgiveness, generosity, being energetic, and also being accountable. Again, I will list these. Again, Ibn al-Qayyim says these are actual synonyms for patience. And you can see in these qualities are qualities that these qualities, some of them are perhaps intrinsic to the human being, and some of them are active states, i.e. you have to cultivate them. Again, he says there's haya, there's self-control, there's discretion, there's abstemiousness. Again, this is zuhud. This is sort of a sense of not coveting what others have. Forbearance, measuredness, courage, forgiveness, generosity, being energetic, and also being accountable. One of the things that Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah says about patience, it's that it has to necessarily manifest itself in people's character. So he looks at really kind of three manifestations of patience. He looks at patience in terms of how does it manifest spiritually, how does it manifest morally and theologically. So again, he presents these three manifestations of patience. Spiritually, he says it resides in worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following his commands. Now, anybody in a position of leadership, and when I say leadership, I don't mean that you're kind of CEO of an organization, perhaps, but it can be other forms of leadership. So whether you are an imam, you are a religious scholar, a preacher, a teacher, a parent, mentor, whether your work is more public, whether your work is more behind the scenes, according to Ibn al-Qayyim, if you are a person that's amongst the sabirin, there are three aspects to this. And the first one, he says, really is more spiritual, and this is, do you have a good foundation of ibadah? Do I have a good foundation of ikhlas, of sincerity in worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? In other words, the leader has to step back and that person has to ask himself or herself, am I actually practicing that which I am enjoining people to follow in terms of taqwa? The second part is abstaining from wrong actions. Again, we see in our public discourse that often there's a gap between what people in positions of authority might say and how they actually might behave. In the context of Palestine, for example, there's a complete vacuum and a complete dearth of Muslim leadership where, again, I'm not going to mention any names or countries specifically, but we're looking at, for example, a place that while there's a place that while the Palestinians are in the midst of a catastrophe and suffering and are the victims of a genocide, in this particular place, they wanted to go ahead and continue with musical concerts with absolutely no regard for what the Sharia says about that, nor the suffering of the Palestinians. So again, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah is saying that, look, this level of patience starts with the leader, and it starts with actually assessing to what extent is that person abstaining from wrong actions himself or herself. Then there's a theological aspect, and I love this because, again, back to the example that I gave you. You are working on something, you are leading a goal, a project, a group. You don't achieve the desired outcome. How do you look at that particular setback? So for Ibn al-Qayyim, he says the theological aspect of sabr, of patience, is to accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. So again, you accept God's decree, Allah ta'ala's qadr, and he brings a quote from Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, and he basically says in this quote, the servant either carries something out, avoids something else, or is patient with the qadr, i.e. these are like the three options in front of us. Either do what you're able to do, avoid doing that which we should not be doing, or otherwise be patient with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I know I need to kind of begin to wrap this up, so I wanted to adhere to time. But let me mention this. He also gives us sort of a legal framework for understanding how to approach patients. So like any good legal scholar, he says that there are some manifestations of patience that are absolutely wajib. They are necessary. In some cases, patience is mandub, recommended. In other cases, he says patience is basically mahdhur or forbidden. In some cases, patience is makruh or disliked. In others, it is mubah or it is sort of permissible. I'm not going to go into all the details of those, but I will say this. He says there's a blameworthy type of patience. And according to Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, the blameworthy type of patience is when we, in the face of needing to express principles, convictions, that if we have a challenge that we are confronting where we need to actually be principled, to speak up, to take a stance, and we decide not to, citing patience or piety, in that case, Ibn al-Qayyim is saying that this is a blameworthy type of patience, because he argues that type of patience contradicts with really the person in a position of leadership, and also is going to take that person away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now remember, the second part of the book is about gratitude, so I need to speak to that a little bit. And the reason why Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya is going to sort of go from patience to gratitude is that he's kind of going back to a hadith of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. So he really sees patience and gratitude as being part of our faith of Iman. And he says, he kind of presents it in these terms. He says that when someone could choose to disobey God, but they abstain from that, they're showing patience in that case. And when someone chooses to obey God, they are showing gratitude or shukr, thankfulness in that case. So he spends part of the book basically trying to figure out which quality is better, which one is more desirable. Is it patience? Is it gratitude? And he brings sayings of different ulama and their positions about it. So he says that there are some people that argued in favor of patience, noting that because God praises patience and the Sabirin, the people of patience, orders us to have patience, mentions it over 90 times in the Quran, then that means that patience is preferred if you have to kind of choose one quality over another kind of in that particular moment. I.e., in other words, we're not saying that one rules out the other, but he's kind of arguing kind of for the merits of one quality based upon how often Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran. Now, another position that he brings, another opinion, is that gratitude is sometimes better than patience. In the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compares gratitude, compares gratitude to faith itself. And that theologically speaking, people are either grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they obey God and they submit, or they are ungrateful and they fall into the category of the disbelievers. Again, the idea of kufr literally being the opposite of shukr. So in terms of which is better, honestly, according to Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, either one that you choose, each one complements the other, and these are qualities we should sort of equally attempt to cultivate. And honestly, he says, Sayyidina Umar really puts it best. Umar says, if I had two riding animals, one animal was called patience and the other was called gratitude, I would not mind which one I picked, because the takeaway from this is that if you cultivate one, invariably it will lead to the other. Bearing in mind that people, of course, are of different attributes and different temperaments. So in conclusion, let me just say this, that for people that are within, that work within the realm of communities, and I think this was echoed earlier, that this is something that there are a lot of lessons in leadership that we can learn from kind of being in community. Because at the end of the day, it's not when we are by ourselves that we are tested in matters of patience and gratitude. It is often when interacting with others that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is really kind of testing us in these qualities. And we know that our beloved Prophet said, alayhi salatu wassalam, that the type of akhlaq for which we are kind of rewarded really is when we are patient in the midst of people, patient when we are dealing with trials, patient with people's ill treatment, and so on. And as I said, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya is someone that really experiences this in a very kind of immediate way, and that's why I shared some of his biography at the outset. So I think with that, are we done? Okay, so I kind of have to. So inshallah, I just want to kind of conclude with just the reminder to myself and everybody here that when we are interacting, say, with somebody and that person is being difficult, let's actually look at these lessons, because at the end of the day, you cannot go wrong if you choose a path of graciousness, patience, forbearance, and also acknowledging the validity of that person's views if applicable in the moment, i.e. kind of showing gratitude in a sense for what they're bringing to you, even if it's challenging. And I think that might be kind of a good way of thinking about how to exemplify leadership in that particular moment. All right, so وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَى سَيِّدِنَا مُحَمَّدٍ وَعَلَى آلِهِ وَصَحْبِهِ وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And do we have a few minutes for questions? Okay. All right, so I just wanted to adhere to the time I was given. So inshallah, if you have any questions or comments, I'll probably just go ahead and I'll be sitting here if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. That was very beneficial. Alhamdulillah, I think patience goes a long way with individuality and both leadership, mashallah. We're going to open it up to Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be open mic, so feel free to raise your hand and ask questions or comments.
Yes. Assalamu alaikum. Yes. So the question is, can I clarify how gratitude leads to patience? So if we reflect, for example, suppose we are in some type of situation where we feel like things are just not going our way. But if we start to reflect on the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even in the midst of that situation, has given us so many blessings, I think that the connection is to me, the connection I think is pretty clear if we just kind of concentrate on the idea that if I'm the opposite of grateful, right? So if I'm ungrateful in this situation and I complain, I become bitter, I rail against fate, then I think being in that state of complaining about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed, it's just going to end up producing a level of kind of anxiety in me and a level of frustration that's really going to, I think, conflict with my ability to be patient. Now, keep in mind that some of this sounds very, very abstract. So this is, your question I think is a very important one. So we have to kind of think about how we can kind of link these two qualities, whether it is about ourselves as individuals, in terms of how we are with our family, in terms of how we are with community matters. And for me, the overriding example of this is the people in Palestine, because to be honest, I'm very embarrassed to kind of even talk about these qualities, given all the comfort and luxury that I enjoy here in the United States. And we have people that have had everything taken from them. So honestly, even though my point of departure was Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya from centuries back, when we first kind of put this topic together, I want us to kind of translate this to what we're seeing amongst the Palestinians. For them, shukr and sabr are not abstract. These are very concrete realities that they have to manifest. And it really kind of all goes back to their language. Like alhamdulillah is such a beautiful, succinct expression, because you hear this coming from the Palestinians. When they say alhamdulillah, that is an expression of shukr, of gratitude that also elevates that person's and amplifies their ability to be patient. So that's how I would kind of answer that. I would say, look at the Palestinians, that not only are they not complaining, they're praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the midst of everything that has happened to them. So you can really kind of see how those practices are coming together and how they are responding to what has really kind of become a second Nakba. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
gratitude because we're trying to make sure that we stay patient and trust Allah. But how do we focus on gratitude as well without doing too much patience?
That's a great question. Thank you, Brother Rehan, for that question. So the question is, let me make sure I understand it. How do we prevent from erring on the side of patience? Perhaps erring too much on the side of patience versus gratitude as people in the West, right? And looking at Palestine. So let me say this. One of the things I do appreciate one of the many things I appreciate about the way that ulama have spoken up and spoken out about this issue is that I've noticed in their pronouncements, they are very careful to still instill in us a sense of hope and gratitude. Because think about it. If our visceral reaction to this tragedy is to question Allah Ta'ala's justice, right? If our visceral reaction is to question Allah Ta'ala's mercy, to question His qadar, we're going to end up in very kind of dangerous territory theologically. So there's a balance of saying, okay, I will be patient and wise in my remarks, and I will not criticize the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the same time, I will be grateful. Whether it's grateful for peace and safety and security, grateful for the ability to speak up and speak out, or frankly, grateful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen people as strong and resilient as the Palestinians to stand in Rabat as guardians over the ummah, frankly, at a time where the rest of us have abdicated our responsibility. All right, so I'm kind of thinking about it in those terms. Now, remember, Ibn al-Qayyim talks a lot about, can I just give you all a summary of his book? He talks a lot about a blameworthy patience. And in my view, again, these are my views. I'm not speaking on behalf of Boston Islamic Seminary, just to clarify that, although I appreciate this platform that has been afforded to me. But in my view, there are people that sadly are manifesting a blameworthy type of patience, in that there's either radio silence on what is happening in Palestine, or the emphasis is on some type of nebulous interfaith work, which, again, as someone who did that for many years, I kind of wonder about the efficacy of that now when I see so many mainstream religious organizations that are endorsing genocide. And I'm not going to say which organizations these are or which faith group, but you all can kind of read between the lines here, I suppose. So I think there's also blameworthy patience where, for reasons of either a pacifist theology or political expediency, we're choosing not to say anything at all, and that's not the time for this. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, Jazakallah khairah. I appreciate it. Are you Safiya? Okay, thank you. So Safiya has a great question about how do you kind of balance between I accept Allah Ta'ala's qadar for this scenario, whatever it is, but if I am someone who's in a position of authority, how do I also make sure that I hold myself to account and assess, did I actually approach this properly, train my team, provide the proper support, and so on? Is that the question? So I'm assuming that we're kind of talking about leadership within an Islamic paradigm. I mean, that's the whole point of the programs at Boston Islamic Seminary. There's the Masters in Islamic Religious Leadership. So I would encourage everybody to get the brochures and look into that program. It's a really good program, alhamdulillah. So within the paradigm of Islamic leadership, remember the leader is someone whom the Prophet ﷺ succinctly characterized as basically a servant. Right? So Sayyid al-Qawmi khadimuhum, that the leader of a people is their servant. So I think that, first of all, if we are someone that's, say, working with a team, you have some kind of supervisory role or so on, that you see yourself more in the role of what can I do to make sure I am of service to this group in terms of providing the amenities that they require. That's very important. Accountability, shura, mutual consultation, a collaborative style. These things are vastly important in Islamic organizations. But I will also say that if you are blessed to be in an organization where there is someone in the role of a religious scholar or a sheikh, that person ultimately is going to have sort of deciding authority over some issues. You know, it's the model of leadership taught to us by the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, look, even if it's just people going on a trip, the sunnah is to actually take someone as an amir over those people. So it's making sure that in that position of responsibility that we are really listening to people, we are empathizing, we are giving them the proper tools and support that they need. We're not leading from a place of kind of stoking our own ego. It's not about the sort of being in a position of authority, but more about the amana that we are upholding for that group. But also understanding, as you said, the idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qadr. Qadr means that I did qadr, so what does it mean to accept qadr? It means that I've done all I could do within the human realm, i.e. I've taken all the necessary steps, I've gone above and beyond, and then I consign the outcome to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? It doesn't mean that if I fail in that project or whatever I'm doing, that I automatically try to point the finger, oh, is this person or that person, or they were the weak link, or they didn't do X, Y, and Z. To understand that I am going to carry all of my team's lapses and failings, and I'm also going to say that the outcome is always with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that you have to, and that's a lesson from the seerah. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam always trusted in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the best outcome. He understood that Allah Ta'ala gives us the means, but the ends are always with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Alhamdulillah. Okay. So Jazakumullah khair, I appreciate your attendance at this session for Boston Islamic Seminary. And again, on your way out, please make sure to grab the postcards and brochures. And Boston Islamic Seminary has classes throughout the academic year as well as in the summer, and an accredited master's program in Islamic religious leadership. So Jazakallah khair, everybody. I appreciate you.